Welcome to the Kirby Center. I'm John Miller, Director of the Dow Journalism Program at the campus in Hillsdale, as Matt Spaulding said. He started out by referring to this painting. When Matt looks at this painting, he sees a bunch of founding fathers, and I suppose we all do. But what first comes to mind for me is the artist Sam Knecht, who is an art professor at the college. I last saw Sam about a day and a half ago when I was picking up my 13-year-old from his house at 10 o'clock at night from a Halloween party. The Knechts had invited the entire 8th grade class from Hillsdale Academy over to their house for a Halloween party, and boy, was Sam relieved to see the parents showing up to take all the kids home. When I see this painting, I think of Sam. Also, when I look at this painting, I think of journalism, because in the painting I see a couple of really important journalists. So we have James Madison in the yellow. James Madison's the little guy, right? Little Jimmy Madison, as they used to say. Alexander Hamilton in the yellow. And Hamilton was many things, but one of the most important things he did, and one of the most lasting of his legacies, is he founded the New York Post, which we still have today. It is one of the longest continuously published newspapers in America. I think it is about the 6th or the 7th most read in America today. And of course, it's most famous for its front page headlines, right? Headless woman in topless bar. You know, that's the New York Post. And we have Alexander Hamilton to thank for that. And there he is in the picture. The other big press guy in this picture is right next to him, seated, is Benjamin Franklin. Right? Again, Benjamin Franklin did many things in his life, but what did he do first? He was a printer. He was basically a newspaper man. He was America's first media mogul, and it was the wealth he generated as a newspaper publisher, as the publisher of Poor Richard's Almanac, which is one of the most successful publications ever in American history. The wealth he made as a printer is what allowed him to go into public life and become an ambassador in London, to sit at the Constitutional Convention and so forth. But he made his fortune in journalism and in publishing and printing, and then he became a statesman. Matt also mentioned a fellow who's not here in this picture, Thomas Jefferson. Well, before we get to that, I'm looking at the wall over there. That picture on the wall over there, that's a newspaper. It's the Providence Gazette and Country Journal, the edition from 1787. The reason it's hanging on the wall there is because it published the Constitution. So these guys, what they wrote, they didn't, attach the document as a PDF file to their emails and send it to all their friends. Americans read the Constitution for the first time in their newspapers, and they read it in newspapers just like the one we have framed over there. So again, journalism is central to what these guys were doing. Now, and boy, the print is really tiny on this thing. They must have had eagle eyes back then or something, but that's hard to read. At any rate, the man not pictured in this, one of them, is Thomas Jefferson, not a newspaper man. He once said, "The man who never looks into a newspaper is better informed than he who reads them." A sentiment we can perhaps all understand. Jefferson deliberately did not engage in journalism. He never wrote for newspapers the way many of these guys did. He made the conscious decision not to, but boy, was he interested in what they were saying. He was deeply involved in manipulating the press, in trying to control the press, and having it say things that would help his partisan causes in the 1790s and beyond. I'm going to say a little bit more about all that in a moment, but Jefferson was a great complainer when it came to the press. And we conservatives are really good at complaining about journalism too, aren't we? We're always complaining about the quality of it and so forth. It reminds me of a joke. Have you heard the one about the reporter who asked Hillary Clinton a really tough question? Neither have I. If you think of a punchline, though, I'm ready to hear it. So we're really good at complaining about the quality of the media and journalism. We're practiced at it. We need to get better at making journalism great. And let's remember, these guys thought journalism was really important. All right, and we should too. We need to complain about it, but we can't scoff at it and we can't disregard it. We need to think about how can we make journalism great. One thing we need to do is make great journalists. That is a thing we can do. It is a long-term project, but it is a thing we can do. I'm going to say a few words about how we might do that and also why the opportunity to do it for conservatives has never been better than it is right now. All right, so that's where I'm headed. But I do want to complain a little bit more. Who watched the CNBC debate the other night? I mean, need we say no more than that about how awful the moderation of that was? There were some fine moments in that debate. They happened despite the moderators, not because of them. In fact, the great moments that happened because of the moderators when the candidates were complaining directly at them about their unfairness, right? You can't have watched that debate and not realize we don't have a problem. The other thing we've been grumbling about recently. Did you see the report about how the New York Times refers to Ben Carson and Jill Biden? Jill Biden, the second lady, she holds a doctorate. She earned a doctorate in education. So of course, the New York Times, on second reference, constantly calls her Dr. Biden, Dr. Biden, Dr. Biden. Then we have Ben Carson, a Republican presidential candidate, an actual medical doctor who saves babies and improves the lives of children and is a genius in the surgery room, apparently. He's Mr. Carson. Mr. Carson in the New York Times. The analysis I saw, it's not always, sometimes they actually do call him Dr. Carson, but the analysis I saw is that Jill Biden is about 3 times as likely as Ben Carson to be referred to as a doctor in the pages of the New York Times. This is a subtle thing, but it's a real thing. And one thing they teach you in journalism is the importance of style and consistency. Right? This is a technical aspect of journalism, the importance of consistency. Every newspaper has its style sheet. So for example, when you refer to a state, if you're from Hillsdale, Michigan, right? How do you write out Michigan? Do you write out Michigan? Do you do M-I-C-H period? Do you do M-I in capital letters like it's on, like you're addressing an envelope? What do? You get these style sheets at publications so that everybody is doing the same thing for purposes of identification. It's a very technical aspect. Publications have different rules, but they try to be, above all, consistent. Right? So the New York Times is violating its own policy with this, a fundamental rule of journalism. It has nothing to do with politics at a certain level, but of course we know it has everything to do with politics. Right? They don't want to call this guy a doctor. Now I do want to emphasize, I do not think that 99% of journalists should give the rest a bad name. Yeah, took you a moment, right? Yeah. Look. There's a lot of bad everything, right? In Washington D.C., there's a lot of bad lawyering. In Silicon Valley, there's bad software programming. For all I know, at Union Station, there's bad shoe shining. And there's a lot of bad journalism. There's going to be a lot of bad journalism no matter what. One of the crucial differences, though, is that journalism is on public display for everybody to see. And this is a hard thing with my students, especially when they start taking journalism classes. I said the first thing you need to do, one of the first things you need to do is develop a thick skin. You're going to be writing for the school newspaper. If you write a lousy paper, on Aristotle or whatever for your politics course and you get a C, you can kind of hide that, not tell anybody. It can be your little secret between you and the professor. If you write a thing in the campus paper, though, and it causes controversy, have fun with that. Right? You will hear about it from your fellow students. And if you have a typo, they'll point that out. If they don't like a thing you said or they want to argue with you, they will do that. This is a public profession in a way a lot of things aren't. There's a public aspect to everything we do. But when you're a journalist, you are on display all the time. And so we see the badness of it, and we're going to see the badness of it. There's no getting around that. There's a different kind of badness, though, when it comes to journalism. That's the badness of bias. And we see that all the time as well. It distorts reality like a funhouse mirror, and then, maddeningly, the people who commit it deny that we've walked into a freak show, right? That's the most aggravating thing about it, is the denial that exists by the people perpetrating it. They refuse to admit it. What do they always say? Oh, I'm objective. And they might even admit, well, yeah, I'm a liberal, I vote such and such a way, but you know, that doesn't affect my news coverage. I'm objective when I'm a reporter. Right, we've all heard this, we've all seen the statistics, and we know it's not true. Becky Quick on CNBC. Remember her question about women earning 77 cents on the dollar compared to men? First of all, number one, that's a Democratic talking point. Number two, you work at CNBC, you're supposed to know a little bit about economics. I mean, what a bogus figure that was. And Marco Rubio handled that question well, I thought, but I just thought, he also could have lashed out at her. What are you doing here? That's a lie. That figure is a lie. And she could have asked the same question to elicit a kind of response she wanted with a different figure, or just ask the question without it. But that statistic is a lie. And there she was on national television, throwing it out like it's the truth. Now, some journalists really do wake up every morning wondering, how can I stick it to conservatives today, right? John Harwood comes to mind. The most embarrassing moment, I thought, during the debate from the moderator side was when he challenged Marco Rubio on his tax plan based upon a misreading of it that he had already been forced to correct, and had corrected it, and yet went back to the same mistake when he was on national television to challenge Rubio. I don't know if you remember that moment, but it was astonishing. And it was, I was watching the whole thing, I was watching it on TV, but then following it on Twitter. 15 minutes later, people were pulling off, Twitter. Here's the link to John Harwood's correction of the story that was wrong about Rubio's tax plan. Then a little bit later, the Tax Foundation comes out, the source he's citing. The Tax Foundation comes out and says, Rubio's right, Harwood's wrong. I mean, my goodness, that's just sheer incompetence.
But it convinces a lot of people that he might be right.
But if you're not digging down into it, you think, oh, some smart people think Rubio's tax plan doesn't add up, whatever, right? That's the impression you walk away with. So I don't know about John Harwood, but I actually think most liberal journalists don't wake up thinking, how am I going to stick it to conservatives today? They wind up sticking it to conservatives, but that's not their conscious plan. Sometimes they just don't know any better. Their bias affects everything they do, and they don't even see it. They're like fish in water, and they don't know they're swimming in water. That's what it's like. That, I think, is the secret of liberal media bias. And they say things like, yeah, I might be liberal, but I'm objective. Well, it infects all they do. So I mentioned style sheets a moment ago. You may have seen a year or two ago, the Associated Press, on its style sheet said, we're no longer going to refer to illegal aliens and illegal immigrants. We're not going to use those terms anymore. Why? Because people can't be illegal, da-da-da-da. You've heard this before, right? But they're not going to use it. This term that most Americans understand, they understand what it means, and the AP is saying, we're going to not use this anymore in any of our reporting. The AP, whose words wind up probably in just about every newspaper in America, they're not going to use those terms. Right? That's a political choice. That's a political choice. But no, they're being objective. We'll still cover this phenomenon of undocumented migration, whatever in the world they're calling it these days. But they're not going to use those terms. Now, words and phrases matter. We know this. George Orwell knew it. 1984, his most famous book, maybe along with Animal Farm, is basically about the importance of words and how they can control us. And if you control language, how you can control society, and why totalitarian societies must control language so that they can control people. That's what 1984 is about. Remember Newspeak, doublethink, right? This is all. This is what it's about. And so in 1984, war is peace, right? That's doublethink. You're holding two contradictory thoughts and believing them both. And so on, and you actually believe the lies you're telling when you speak these words. That's what Orwell's all about. And you think about it, it affects everything we do. I mean, we call this thing that CNBC did, we call that a debate. That wasn't a debate, right? We call it a debate because we're used to calling these things debates. You know, I don't know, what was it, a multi-candidate forum? A what? A roast. You know, it was sort of a, you know, it had a little flavor of a press conference to it. You know, and there were a couple times when candidates actually exchanged with each other. It sort of felt like a debate for, you know, a little flash, but then they went back to another thing. What they're doing has its utility, but it's not a debate, right? We call it that, but it's not a debate, right? So basic words we're using are wrong all the time, and boy, do these words matter. There was a study a number of years ago that some psychologists ran, and they brought a bunch of people into an auditorium, and they showed them a film of two cars colliding. And everybody watched this, and then they split up into two groups. And one group, after having seen this film, now in another room, was asked, at what speed were the cars traveling when they crashed together? And people wrote down their answers. And the next room, and they said, and I'm making this up, but you'll get the point. They said, oh, they were traveling at 50 miles an hour when they crashed together. Then in the next room, they asked everybody, at what speed were the cars traveling when they made contact with each other? Crashed and made contact. Crashed said it was like 50 miles an hour. Made contact, it was like 30 miles an hour. Right? The words we use change our perceptions of reality. Now, the people who did this study, they were interested in juries and memories for witnesses in court trials and so on. You can see why this would matter for a thing like that. But we also see how changing a single word alters our perception of reality, right? So when we choose single words, we're changing what people think about politics. Orwell understood this. We need to do a better job of understanding it. I mean, even the word conservative is problematic, right? We use it because we're used to using it. It describes a certain kind of person in the United States. It's a diverse movement, but we kind of get it when someone's an American conservative, you know what that means. Have you ever noticed, though, when they talk about conservatives in Iran, who they're talking about? Or remember during the Cold War, who the conservatives in the Kremlin were? These were the bad guy hardliners, by the way, the ones who opposed Reagan more than anybody else. But as you go on your tour of the world with American journalists and you hear about the conservative forces in Islam or the conservative forces in Cuba or North Korea or whatever, they're talking about a thing that is diametrically different from what conservatives are in the United States. So all the time we're using the word conservative in ways that imply certain things to readers of newspapers, watchers of television shows, and so on. You know, you call someone a conservative, a Kremlin conservative, it makes a kind of sense. I understand why they're doing that. You know, small c conservative is kind of a relative distinction between other people, but boy, is it loaded. And many of them don't even know they're doing it. A few know they're doing it. What they're doing, though, is causing trouble. The very worst journalists, of course, flirt with the totalitarianism that George Orwell opposed. Last December, at the University of Iowa, they had some visiting professor who wanted to make an anti-racist sculpture and place it on campus, you know, because we need to do that on campuses. And so he makes a sculpture of a Klansman and sort of dresses him in like newspaper print. And I don't quite get what he was going for, but he made this statue and puts it in the middle of campus at the University of Iowa, and it's supposed to be some kind of anti-racist statement, right? Well, you can imagine what happened next. The sort of offense that was taken, the controversy this caused, you know, the removal, and so on. At the time, though, the guy who runs the journalism program at the University of Iowa said this. His name's David Rife, R-Y-F-E. He said, if it was up to me and me alone, I would follow the lead of every European nation and ban this type of speech. When you have journalism professors talking about banning speech, we have a problem, right? I mean, this guy should be you kind of want him to be a hardliner on the First Amendment, and yet he's not. You know who does ban speech? The Cubans, the North Koreans, the Saudi Arabians, the Iranians. Those are the people who ban speech. And the journalism chief at the University of Iowa. Now, his timing could not have been worse, because what happens 2 weeks later? A bunch of crazed gunmen storm a magazine office in France and kill a dozen people in the Charlie Hebdo massacre. They wanted to ban speech too. And they were willing to do it with guns and violence, not with laws. So his timing was awkward. And it's easy to march and say, we're all Charlie. Remember that slogan from last January and February, we're all Charlie. It's harder to print the first post-massacre magazine cover of that magazine. We all saw it. Remember the green background had Muhammad on, sort of a cartoon Muhammad on it? The New York Times didn't publish it. They didn't publish it. I'm not unsympathetic to that decision. That's a hard thing. You don't want to be the next target. But you know what the New York Times did publish? They published Piss Christ. Remember that thing that our government funded back in 1990 or whenever it was? A photograph of a crucifix submerged in urine called Piss Christ, funded by the NEA. They published that. They also published the image of a picture, an image called Holy Virgin Mary by an artist named Chris O'Feely that was put on display in a museum in Brooklyn. It had a picture of Mary covered in elephant dung and pornography. The New York Times published that too. I guess they're not worried about the Christian terrorists. But think about it. If you're going to do one thing, do the other. If you're going to offend everybody or offend nobody. But these are the choices they're making. These are the choices they make all the time. And those are flamboyant examples. But I want to say it actually drills down to the level of the words they use to describe the events that they're objectively covering. They're objective. They're always objective. Now, when the founders wrote the Constitution, when this was happening, they actually lived in an era of wild partisanship in the media. If you think, Alexander Hamilton, why did he start the New York Evening Post? He called it the Evening Post at the time. He started the New York Evening Post because he couldn't stand Thomas Jefferson. He wanted the New York Post to become an anti-Jeffersonian mouthpiece for the Federalist Party. That's why he started the New York Post, for a specifically political objective. And again, at this time, if you think Twitter is mean today, if you think the comments section at the bottom of your favorite blog are really nasty, you should see what the newspapers were saying about these guys back at that time. We have this image of Washington, this revered figure. Nobody criticized George Washington. Everybody loved George Washington. Everybody respected Washington, kind of. In fact, he was a target of fierce press criticism in the 1790s. We hear all this stuff. He had no intention of becoming a monarch. He did all these things to prevent people from thinking he was becoming a monarch. One of the reasons we hear that is because he was denying it all the time, because he was being accused of it all the time by the opposition press. Okay? So journalism back then was wild. There were few rules. It was deeply partisan. And if they managed to give us the Constitution, not a bad outcome. And for many years, for decades, our press was aligned with parties. We see vestiges of it today with something like the Arkansas Democrat Gazette. The word Democrat right in the title. The big newspaper in Tallahassee, Florida is also called the Tallahassee Democrat. You ever heard of the Springfield Republican? Right, a newspaper in Massachusetts. I'm not sure how Republican it is anymore, but they still call it that. And the reason it has that name is because it was specifically aligned with the party. So we see vestiges of that today, although we don't really have the same kind of thing, right, where they're not explicitly aligned with parties. What happened? What happened is that we had the rise of objectivity. And this happened in journalism for two reasons. One of them commercial, the other ideological. The commercial reason was you had all these newspapers around America that were aligning themselves with parties. And some people having the idea, wouldn't it be great if we could sell our copies to everybody, not just half the country? I'd like to sell to Republicans and Democrats. How do we do that? Well, When the Mexican War started, a bunch of newspapers pooled their resources to send reporters down to Mexico to cover that conflict. It's expensive to send reporters abroad. They pooled together to get their resources, and this was the birth of the Associated Press. And the idea was they're going to report on events and they're going to provide their information, their copy, back to all the subscribers to this service, right? Well, these guys had to be above partisanship because they were selling their copy to Republican papers, to Democrat papers, and so on. So they started to not speak in as partisan ways. They started to write in ways that weren't quite as partisan. They did it for a commercial reason, right? So this starts happening in the middle of the 19th century, and then we get the progressive movement later on. The progressive movement, with its cult of expertise, of technocratic expertise, along with the weakening of political parties. And together you get sort of the professionalization of journalism. You get this notion that just as we can have scientific experts running the government for us and telling us what's good for it, and sort of is with the birth of the administrative state, we get the same kind of thing in journalism. We're going to have experts running journalism, reporting on for us, and they're going to be above politics, just like the bureaucrats. We know how that turned out with the bureaucracies and with the IRS scandals you've just gone through and so on. Everything is deeply politicized in the administrative state. They deny it, but it's all deeply politicized. Well, the same thing happened in journalism. Okay, so they baked the liberalism right into the cake when this happened. So we wind up with the cult of objectivity by about the middle of the 20th century. And we only have, we have a number of news sources, but they're also limited in a way. Remember when there were only 3 news stations? You could watch, the evening news, you could only watch 3 stations now. Back then, well, all that's fallen apart, these mainstream media behemoths. I mean, when was the last time anybody in this room actually sat down and watched the nightly news at 6 o'clock on a major network, right? I mean, 20 years ago, we were all doing it. And we knew who the anchors were. Can you guys even name an anchor? Who is even the anchor of ABC News now? I have no idea, right? We know who it was in the 80s, though. Who was it in the 80s? Well, he was CBS. Peter Jennings. And then Tom Brooks. I mean, we remember who used to do it. We don't know who does it right now. And that's a simple, and my students, my goodness, they don't even know who used to do it. Right? They have no idea who these people were. Right? They inhabit, and we remember what the old world of media used to look like. Our students today have no clue at all. I mean, I can tell them about it, but they haven't experienced it, right? By the way, the thing I say to people, we're about 2 years away from a college freshman who has no memory of 9/11. Yeah, it's like how time flies, right? I realized when I first got to Hillsdale 4 years ago, I realized this was going to be a problem, the sort of, my aging. When I made a reference to the TV show Cheers, and not a single kid knew what I was talking about. It's like, oh, wow, I have to update my cultural references. But anyway, we remember when there was sort of this monolithic control over the news. It was just a few rooms in America, and they all kind of thought alike, and so on. Now, when I was a young journalist, which was, I graduated more than 20 years ago, and I came to Washington. I was a conservative. I wanted to do conservative journalism. Well, what were the options, right? There was, you get a job in the mainstream media, and lots of conservatives did, right? Let's not forget that has happened. But that's hard. It's intimidating. Back then, what was there? There was, so the Washington Star was defunct, but the Washington Times existed. So there were a handful of newspapers with maybe friendly editorial pages here or around the country. There was the Wall Street Journal, National Review, which is where I eventually went to work. But boy, we're counting on one hand. That's what the scene looked like when I graduated in 1982. In fact, my first job in journalism, I came to Washington. I worked for the New Republic. It's a left-leaning magazine. My boss was Fred Barnes, right? So, Fred hired me. But that's what it was like. It's a lot different. Then, a lot of things started happening, though. In 1988, we had the Reagan administration repealed the Fairness Doctrine, the so-called Fairness Doctrine. Suddenly we have the birth of talk radio on the AM dial, which conservatives came to dominate. Fox News started in 1996, and within 4 or 5 or 6 years, it was the #1 provider of news on cable. And you've probably seen they've been gloating about this ever since. They have their big ads about how badly they beat CNN and MSNBC. But the really important, most disruptive factor was the internet, and it just changed everything. At National Review, we put out a magazine every other week. We're not as fast as a weekly, we're not as slow as a monthly, right? We're a fortnightly. It's an odd format. But when I joined National Review, that was the pace. Filing copy every other week and so on. And then, within actually a few months of my joining the staff, we had National Review Online, and suddenly it's every day, every hour, every minute, and how fast can you post? It transformed the culture of National Review. But the bottom line is the internet caused this crack up, and we've seen this incredible proliferation of publications. Right? Some are legacy publications. National Review's been around for a while. You can still see the Washington Times online and so on. But we have the Daily Caller, the Washington Free Beacon, the Washington Examiner. What else? Where else do we get our news from? The who? IJ Review, which is a thing I'd never even heard of a year ago, and suddenly it's dominating social media. All these news organizations rising up and giving voice to conservative ideas like never before. And so what we have today is an environment that's an awful lot like what these guys faced, right? We have news organizations that are, if not partisan, at least explicit in what their commitments are. Yeah, we're conservative or we're libertarian, and many are liberal. We still have plenty of journalists who insist that they're objective and so forth. But we don't really we don't believe. We never believed it, but boy, we don't believe it. We don't believe it now. We revere the founders, and we need to remember how important journalism was to who they were, what they did, and what they accomplished. What were the Federalist Papers? We buy them now in a book and read them like a text. That's how our students at Hillsdale College encounter them, like it's a book you pull off the shelf. The Federalist Papers were op-eds. They were newspaper op-eds. They've just been collected and brought together and numbered. That's what we've done now. So we actually don't remember that they're op-eds. We don't think of them as journalism, but that's what they were. They were newspaper op-eds. If Thomas Paine were alive today, he would be an excellent blogger, and Common Sense would be an ebook. One of my favorite journalists from this era is a fellow named James Callender, who is, journalists don't speak about him very much at all because he's a little disreputable. They don't talk about him in journalism school, but he broke two of the biggest stories in American history. In the 1790s, he wrote the story that exposed Alexander Hamilton's adultery. And if, has anybody seen the musical Hamilton? This big thing that's in New York now that you may have heard about it. This is actually, it's a piece of that musical. Well, when we think of, who's the greatest founding father who didn't become president? It's probably Alexander Hamilton, maybe Ben Franklin, but Hamilton maybe tops that list. He's the guy on our currency who is not a president, right? Well, why didn't he become president? There are a bunch of reasons he didn't become president. One is because he had to admit an adulterous affair in the 1790s that this journalist, James Callender, exposed. Well, then what happened? Fast forward a few years, Callender got really hacked off at President Jefferson. He had been a mouthpiece for Jefferson, trying to hurt Hamilton in the 1790s. Then Jefferson made him mad, and he switched sides. So what's the next big story he broke? Sally Hemings. He gave us a Sally Hemings story. Now, he was reporting a rumor, and his standards were really low about what he was willing to put into print, right? I mean, his sourcing on that was bad, and it would not have gotten into the campus paper at Hillsdale College, right? But you got to give it to the guy. We're still talking about that one, right? My point is, we think about, the journalists today, the paparazzi and the journal, they're prying into our private lives and expose. They did it to these guys. Okay, these guys knew about that as much as we know about that. That's an important thing to remember, just this environment they were in. And now, I've actually come to see this as a great corrective. Matt Spalding a few moments ago said, we need to be more political, not less political, more political when it comes to judicial nominations. Let's talk about politics. Let's not pretend we're not talking about politics when we really are. Let's talk about politics and be explicit with what we believe and what our principles are and so forth. Let's be as political as possible. I think our journalism should be the same way. And that's not to say journalists should, number one, for your journalists, tell the truth. But tell the truth as you see it. Declare your biases, have conversations, and we'll all be better for it. That's the system. We want, and that's why it is easier for young conservatives to get jobs in the media than ever before, because there are all these publications, and I'll tell you, they are hungry. They're starving for Hillsdale College students or conservative students from any campus in America, really, if they can write well, if they're willing to work hard. This is a rare commodity. With our Dow journalism program, we don't even come close to filling the ranks of these publications, but nobody does. This is actually, we have a human capital deficit in the conservative movement when it comes to media and journalism. And we need to do a better job of producing these young people. So at Hillsdale, we have the Dow journalism program where we focus on doing it through our campus paper and our internships. And I've been doing it now for 4 years. We've had one of our graduates is now at the Wall Street Journal editorial page. We have another at Fox News. They've even gone on to write for the Daily Beast and Slate and National Review. We're taking over National Review. My favorite example, though, is last. My favorite recent example, though, is last May we had a young man graduate, and he is now working at Guns and Ammo magazine in Peoria, Illinois, which I love because I'll guarantee you the Columbia School of Journalism has never produced a kid who went on to go work at Guns and Ammo magazine, but we do that at National Review or at Hillsdale College. And one more thing, we're here today to dedicate the radio studio here at the Kirby Center. You guys are going to see it. You're going to see how great it is and what an excellent tool this is going to be for extending the mission of the college and talking about politics and principles to as wide an audience as possible. We just started a radio station on campus. It's a low-power FM signal. Right now we're just playing a playlist of patriotic songs, but we're working toward a moment when we have an adult, grown-up station manager who involves students and gets them practicing the art of rhetoric on the radio. Why are we doing this? Because we want to make sure our students can communicate and tell stories and have interviews as well as possible. And that's going to serve them no matter what they do. It's going to serve them well if they want to. If a student wants to be the next Hugh Hewitt, come to our radio station and practice. But I'll tell you what, if you want to be a lawyer, if you want to be a candidate for office, if you want to be a teacher, come practice it at our radio station. We're moving towards that. And so that's just now getting off the ground. So that's another thing we're doing to help change the culture of media and journalism. So what you're here today for, the dedication night, is one aspect of that. We're going to be linking the studio here with the station in Hillsdale and start to do great things. So I think that we'll probably always complain about liberal media bias, but we need to start doing something about it. And I'll contend the solution to liberal media bias is conservative journalists, and we need to produce more, we need to make more, and help them take advantage of the unique opportunity we find ourselves in today that didn't exist a generation ago. So thanks very much. We'll do some questions, and we've got young ladies with microphones. If you want to raise your hand, they'll give you a mic. Ask into the microphone, and we'll go here and then this guy.
John, you kind of stretched the term journalist. How would you define what is a journalist?
That's a great question. So there are a few ways I have fun with this. One of the things I like to do with my students, often on the first day of class in one of my journalism classes, I'll say what's a newspaper for? And they'll raise their hands and they'll give me these earnest answers about informing the citizenry and stuff like that. And I'll remind them a newspaper is for making money. It's a business. Right? Let's never forget that there are publishers who are trying to make a living at this, and so on. Having said that, we need to step back and talk about what is quality journalism and how can that contribute to a successful business model. I define journalism as the literature of what's just happened. Telling the truth about events we've seen or observed. That's what journalism is. I define it pretty broadly. Is everybody a journalist? Sometimes you hear that. I don't quite believe that. There are some standards to journalism and so on, but ultimately we need journalistic organizations that earn our trust through their professionalism, their real objectivity, not their phony objectivity. And journalism can be an awful lot of things, but it's telling us what just happened. With this gentleman here.
Sometimes it's for wrapping fish.
Sometimes, yes. It's fish wrap by Friday. Yep.
But my question really is, would you comment on the new movie Truth?
I have not seen it. This is the Dan Rather film.
Yes, the Dan Rather thing.
So Dan Rather, as he put it, he put the BS back in CBS, right? I've not seen the film. I can't comment on the film, but boy, did that career go up in smoke. And you know what? You know when that wouldn't have happened? That wouldn't have happened before the internet. That would not have happened if he had pulled that stunt in about 1985 when he was anchoring the CBS Evening News. There would have been a very different response. The reason why he was held accountable was because of bloggers and because of independent investigators and even non-professional journalists looking into things like typewriter fonts, right? And it wasn't there was I forget all the details of that case, but there the font in one of these letters was not available and when it was supposedly typed, but it took that level of expertise. And I'll tell you, a political reporter at the New York Times or the Washington Post would not have found that information even if they'd gone looking. It took the sort of crowdsourcing potential of the internet for that to come up and to destroy. Well, he wasn't destroyed by other people. He destroyed himself. But to let that immolation occur, it took the internet, and that's, I think, the lesson here is that the accountability now is different and it's better.
The same thing happened to a so-called birth certificate, to no avail.
Well, yeah.
Working with students, I'm curious as how they get their information, how they get their news.
First of all, they do it this way. They do it on their phones. Number one.
And do they read newspapers at all?
Yeah. So they are almost entirely digital. You've heard the term digital natives. I mean, they're born into this, right? I still get my Wall Street Journal in the mail, and I turn the pages every day, and I like doing that, and I'm never going to change, and it's just a function of my age, right? Our students today, newspapers, why would you look at a newspaper? Right, when you get everything. Well, so that's the second part, and that's one of the problems is they don't always know what the right filters are. What are the best sources? And when you have social media, you can get sent all over the place with sources and so forth. What they just need to become intelligent readers and find sources they trust over time. There are a lot of good news gathering organizations out there, and they need to start developing the kinds of brand loyalties we all have. Some get better or worse, but they just need to be readers of the news. I'm usually just gratified when they're paying attention to the news, right? That's to see the curiosity and the interest. That's we can get into some of the deeper questions later. But I think if they're smart and they're genuinely curious and so on, they'll figure out what the what the good news sources are. But we do need these filters, and that's why, everyone's a journalist. Well, in a sense, yeah, but we need really great journalistic organizations where writers have editors, and you have people second guessing things, and you have the guy who's willing to stand up to Dan Rather and say, I don't think this is right. You need organizations that have that kind of built-in capability, and they do exist. They do exist.
You talked a little bit about publications producing material on a weekly, fortnightly, monthly basis, and a daily basis in newspapers. Can you talk a little bit about how journalism has changed in terms of the velocity of news produced, almost down to the minute?
Yeah, so that's exactly what's happening. In journalism, there's always been an interest in being first with the news. And this was true with old daily newspapers and everything. You want to be the first to report something. You want to beat the competition on that, even if it's just, by an hour or whatever. There's always been a premium on that, even when things move slowly compared to today. Now it's really, you want to be first to the news. You want to get that drudge link. You want everybody kind of going back to you as the person who broke the story. This has created some awkwardness. Because you can be so fast now. You're a tweet away from breaking the news. Are you sure? Are you sure with what you're reporting? I remember when the first Obamacare decision came out. We all tuned to our TVs at 10 o'clock in the morning or whatever it was on a weekday, and they had these people lined up in the Supreme Court office where they were distributing the opinion, who would sprint out of the Supreme Court and hand it over to the news anchor, as fast as possible. And the news anchor would be on live TV, reading through this thing. And I don't know if you remember this, but the first thing they started saying within 30 seconds is, they've overturned Obamacare, right? And then there was, about 3 or 4 minutes later, it's like, oh, wait, we were completely wrong when we said that, right? So we're seeing more of that. And it's like, why don't we turn our TVs off at 10 o'clock, give them an hour to read the thing, and then come back and tell us really what happened. So oftentimes you just need to slow down, because the only thing worse than being second in the race to the news is being wrong about the news. And we're seeing an awful lot of wrong.
It's practical in the modern day from a business perspective that, if you're not first, you're last kind of, for some of these,
Well, you don't want, you want to be quick and you want to be right. And so I guess there's a balance to be struck. And that's why we need high quality people making these judgments. And, so when the Supreme Court case comes down, you actually know how to read an opinion and see what it says and start talking about it. But don't be wrong, for heaven's sake. And so there's an awful lot of wrong out there now because of the pressure to be first, which has always existed, but which is more intense now. Do we have a question over here?
Yeah, because I want to understand why other people with differing opinions have the opinions that they have. I live in my car, so I listen to XM, and I bounce between Fox, CNN, BBC, and it is mind-blowing how the same event can be reported in such vastly different ways that I can't believe anything other than people are being willfully misled. Yeah. They are being willfully misled. I think about the Benghazi hearings, last week, and I listened to that on C-SPAN because I didn't want to get any spin, and how all of the, most of the media, said Hillary came out of it smelling like a rose. Yeah. And if you boil away all the rhetoric and grandstanding and everything else, what it boils down to is these were the emails, and this is what she said.
Yeah. So one story is we finally nailed her. We know she's a liar now, right? And then the other one was, boy, she deflected those questions well, right? And way to go, Hillary. Yeah. That's a real problem. There is a strength in the diversity, though, because a generation ago you would have only gotten the one. Now we get both. And so it allows a kind of raucous debate, and we can worry about people talking past each other, and that's a problem, and I hate to see it, and we all hate to see it because we want a kind of engagement here. On the one hand, on the other hand, the conversation was completely one-sided a generation ago. Now at least it's two-sided, and I think we'll be better at getting at the truth. And if somebody really wants to find out what people said about Benghazi and what really happened, there are still some unanswered questions, obviously. But with a little bit of research, I think we can get at the truth. And if you remove blinders, you'll be able to make judgments about people and decisions and so forth.
How do we create an awareness in the public that they are being misled, or that at least they need to guard against being misled, get news from varying sources so that you know?
Yeah, most studies indicate most people actually follow the news closely, actually do go and search out alternative viewpoints, and so it sounds like you do that yourself a little bit, and that can be frustrating. But I often want to know, what are they thinking on NPR, right? I'm kind of curious about that, and so on. How do we look? Yeah, look. So in the wild world of 1790s journalism and the kind that I'm suggesting we're headed towards today, there are going to be a lot of problems. There's going to be a lot of mistakes. There's going to be a lot of unfairness. But it's in its way, it's kind of better, and it's better for us as conservatives, because now at last we're actually being heard. Yep.
You talk about two-sided conversation. It does seem like that one side is very heard. It certainly doesn't have much of a voice. If we look at our university system, schools of journalism, the entire media, I would just like to know why the left has so much exposure, why they have this tremendous influence. How did we get like this? Is their story better?
Yeah. So there's a lot to go in here, say about that. One of the most important things, though, is not enough conservatives have gone into journalism. They've chosen not to do it. And they've chosen not to do it for some really good reasons. Why not go start a business? Why not go do another thing? Why would you go into a profession that is, by reputation, so dominated by liberals? I don't mind. You can even say to yourself, I don't mind working with liberals, but are they going to give me the promotions that I'm going to earn? Is it going to be fair? If they're not fair with their news coverage, are they going to be fair in the newsroom? So you can understand why conservatives would steer away from it. On the other hand, on the other side, journalism, it's always been a little bit adversarial. It has certainly since Woodward and Bernstein had a kind of let's change the world, let's be champions of this or that cause. And so what we have here is a phenomenon that it attracts liberals and it repels conservatives. And as a result is we don't have enough conservatives going into the field. And so one of my messages to conservatives is you guys have never had it easier. To the young ones, right, who are thinking about their job prospects, it's like, oh my goodness. I get a call every week from somebody saying, I want a Hillsdale student, right? And I'm like, get in line and pay them a lot of money because there's practically a bidding war for our students. And the demand for conservatives who can write well and work hard is so strong. We need to correct this. We need to correct this human capital deficit on our side. We need to produce more good conservatives in every kind of field. But journalism, we're just crying out for them. And when we start producing more, some of these problems will begin to improve. We got time for one more question. Yes.
Quick question on there might be a little project that's worth your time and interest, and that is the Southern Poverty Law Center is becoming very entrenched in the Justice Department for giving advice, and it's now worked its way up to the AP. And I don't know if you're aware, but Matt Staver has just been labeled in an AP story that went everywhere as the way that SPLC would want them, which is a group of people putting their way. So there's a big group letter that the Family Research Council is starting to move around to the conservative movement, and suggestions from you on what can be done to make sure these people are not credentialed, because they're casting key conservatives who think like Hillsdale does as extremists, which falls into this whole thing that Obama's doing that negates real extremists and terrorists.
Right, so this, I think you're referring to the Southern Poverty Law Center's like violence extremism project, right? Where they, you know, what are the examples of violent extremism in American society? And of course there's, you know, terrorism as we traditionally understand it and we've seen inflicted upon our country, but they're also talking about, I think they named the Family Research Council as an extremist organization, right? This is an ideological group, and it has, you know, Southern Poverty Law Center, like, who's against poverty, right? They have one of these names that sounds, well, who could be against that, right? But it turns out they have a deeply ideological agenda, and I think, you know, we need to educate, first of all, readers and voters that, you know, who they are and what they say is not to be trusted, and then secondarily, call out the journalists who cite them as if they're unbiased sources. Oh, the Southern Poverty Law Center has identified such and such as an extremist group. Well, there's something going on here. But when we have an environment when, you know, Becky Quick can talk about 77 cents on the dollar, I mean, you know, how far are we away from a Republican presidential debate where somebody cites this organization as if it's authoritative? I just think we've got to call them on it. We've got to do it through social media and do it fast. All right, folks, thanks a lot.